The history of the Gothic War records that Battlefleet Gothic 1, 20 years of grinding naval combat across 100 star systems, the defense of the Cadian Gate, the relief of Schindelgeist, the final battles above Fularis II, where the last of Abaddon the Despoiler's fleets broke and retreated into the Eye of Terror. The Warmaster of Chaos had come for the Gothic sector and had not taken it. Admiral Cornelius von Ravensburg's name was inscribed in the Hall of Heroes on Cipra Mundi. By every official measure, the Imperium had prevailed. Abaddon took 3 of the 6 most destructive weapons ever discovered with him when he left. The Gothic War lasted 20 years and cost the Imperium millions of soldiers, hundreds of warships, and dozens of inhabited worlds. In terms of what it actually decided, it lasted 20 years and gave Abaddon the operational education he needed to wage the 13th Black Crusade 400 years later. The Blackstone fortresses, which had stood in the Gothic sector for longer than the Imperium had existed, which had survived the rise and fall of the Eldari Empire, which predated every living faction in the galaxy by millions of years, were the reason for all of it. And when the war was over, the side that understood them walked away, the side that did not wrote victory parades. This is the story of the Blackstone fortresses, not only what they did in the Gothic War, though that is part of it, what they are, what they were built for, and why the most terrifying weapon in the 41st millennium was never designed by Chaos, never engineered by the Adeptus Mechanicus, never forged in the furnaces of a god. It was inherited by both sides, and neither one has ever fully understood what it was holding. The Gothic sector sits near the Cadian Gate, the narrow corridor between the Eye of Terror and the wider galaxy. This is not coincidence. The corridor exists because the pylons beneath Cadia's surface maintain a partial containment of the warp rift, and the stability they create runs in a rough line through adjacent systems. Where the eye cannot expand, space is slightly more navigable, slightly more real. Throughout this corridor, embedded in the void between star systems, 6 massive structures had been detected by Mechanicus survey vessels as early as the mid-37th millennium. They were identified as orbital fortifications of unknown origin, immensely ancient, apparently inert. The Mechanicus called them Blackstone fortresses on account of the material from which they were constructed, a dark, dense, non-reactive substance that absorbed rather than reflected light, and resisted every standard analysis tool the Adeptus Mechanicus brought to bear. Cutting instruments made no impression on it. Sonic bombardment left no mark. Whatever the Blackstone fortresses were made of, it was not adamantium, not void-forged ceramite, not any material in the Mechanicus inventory. They were enormous. The smallest of the 6 measured roughly 12 kilometers along its primary axis. The largest exceeded 30. They were not ships. They had no visible propulsion systems and no apparent energy sources. They rotated slowly in place, precisely oriented, their angular relationships to one another consistent across centuries of observation. The Mechanicus Magi who examined them from safe distances produced 12,000 pages of analysis that reached a single agreed conclusion. The fortresses were built by a non-human civilization of extraordinary technological capacity and were no longer active. They posed no immediate threat. They could not be boarded, their surfaces being featureless and entirely without entry points visible to standard sensors. They could not be moved. They were, as far as the Imperium could determine, monuments, relics of a civilization that had left nothing else behind. The reports were filed. The Gothic sector went about its business. The Inquisitor, known as Covenant, reached a different conclusion. Covenant operated within the orders of the Inquisition for decades before the Gothic War. His specific focus was Xenos archaeology, the study of non-human civilizations and their material remains. Where the Mechanicus saw inert structures of non-reactive material, Covenant saw weapons. The angular relationships between the 6 fortresses were not decorative, he argued in his submitted analysis. They were functional. The precise orientations, maintained through apparent passive means with no energy expenditure the Mechanicus could detect, suggested that the structures were in a dormant state, not a dead one. Something was keeping them oriented. Something was maintaining those angles. The Mechanicus had looked at the fortresses and seen architecture. Covenant looked at them and saw a targeting system. His reports were not ignored. They were filed under a classification that meant they would be read by approximately 37 senior inquisitors in the following 50 years, none of whom acted on them in any coordinated way. The Gothic sector had enough problems. The fortresses were not moving. The sector moved on. This is how the Imperium works, not through conspiracy or deliberate suppression, though both exist within its institutions. Through the weight of 10,000 years of bureaucratic accumulation, Covenant's analysis was technically correct in every particular. It reached the right people. They read it, noted it, and redirected their attention to more immediate crises. The fortresses waited. They had been waiting for millions of years. A few more decades meant nothing to them. By the late 41st millennium, the Gothic sector was one of the more strategically significant imperial territories in the Segmentum Obscurus. 22 inhabited systems, multiple forge worlds supplying material to the Cadian Gate defenses, established naval yards capable of constructing and maintaining Emperor-class battleships, populations in the hundreds of billions. It was not a prosperous sector by imperial standards. Being close enough to the Eye of Terror that warp interference created consistent navigational hazards and periodic incursions from raiding forces. But it was vital. The loss of the Gothic sector would put direct pressure on the Cadian Gate, the single most important choke point in the Segmentum, the gap through which every Black Crusade had poured since Abaddon first led the forces of Chaos out of the Eye in the 8th Black Crusade. Battlefleet Gothic was the naval force assigned to the sector. It was large by the standards of a sector fleet, comprising nearly 300 vessels at full strength, including a complement of Lunar-class cruisers and several of the older Dominator-class cruisers that had been serving in the sector since before the Indomitus Crusade. Its commander in the years leading up to the 12th Black Crusade was Admiral Cornelius von Ravensburg, a veteran officer who had spent 30 years in Gothic sector commands and understood its navigational peculiarities and tactical geography better than almost any other officer in the Segmentum. Ravensburg did not know about Covenant's reports. He had not been briefed on the theoretical weapon status of the 6 large orbital structures scattered through his sector. He knew they were there. Every navigation chart showed them. His ships had conducted standard surveys of all 6 at various points. They were inert. They posed no navigational hazard. They were not worth worrying about. This was entirely reasonable. It was also, as events would prove, catastrophically wrong. The Eldari knew. Of all the living species in the galaxy, the Eldar were the most likely to have retained institutional knowledge about the fortresses, given the age of their civilization and their specific interest in warp-related technology. The craft world Eldari had long-range seers who tracked the movement of forces through the warp with a precision that no imperial astropathic choir could match. And the seers of Ulthwé, the craft world closest to the Eye of Terror and the most exposed to chaos incursion, had been watching the Gothic sector with increasing concern for the better part of 2 centuries before the first Chaos fleet appeared. They did not share what they knew with the Imperium. The relationship between Craftworld Eldari and Imperial authorities was not one of partnership. It was a series of tactical collaborations of pure mutual convenience, entered into with suspicion on both sides, and abandoned the moment it became strategically inconvenient. The Eldari kept their own counsel and moved their forces as they judged necessary. The Imperium did not ask. The Imperium rarely asked. Abaddon, the despoiler, had been planning what would become the Gothic War for longer than most of Battlefleet Gothic's senior officers had been alive. The records recovered from Chaos-held worlds after the Gothic War, combined with inquisitorial analysis of Abaddon's operational history, allow a reasonably clear reconstruction of his strategic intentions. Abaddon did not come to the Gothic sector to conquer it. He came to learn. This distinction, which seems straightforward in retrospect, was the central misunderstanding that cost the Imperium the war while it was winning the battles. The Black Crusades are numbered. The Imperium counts 13 of them before the fall of Cadia. But the numbering implies equivalence. It implies that each crusade was doing the same thing with varying degrees of success. This is not accurate. Each Black Crusade served a different strategic purpose for Abaddon. Several were diversionary. Several were intended to bleed specific Imperial strategic reserves. 2 were deliberately designed to fail in conventional military terms while achieving a separate objective. The 12th Black Crusade, the Gothic War, was designed to give Abaddon operational control over 3 Blackstone fortresses and the information he needed to eventually master them. The Chaos forces that entered the Gothic sector in approximately 139 of the 41st Millennium were not the full strength Abaddon could have brought to bear. They were sufficient to overwhelm any immediate Imperial response, to capture or neutralize key Imperial worlds, and to secure the fortresses. They were not sufficient to hold the sector indefinitely against a full Imperial counter-offensive. Abaddon did not need to hold the sector indefinitely. He needed enough time. The fortresses activated when Chaos forces came into contact with them. This was the first indication that Covenant's analysis had been correct. The Mechanicus survey vessels that had spent decades attempting to enter the fortresses without success found that boarding actions launched from Chaos spacecraft encountered no resistance. Docking ports opened. Interior corridors were navigable. Power systems came online. The fortresses were responding to the presence of the warp-attuned, to individuals and crews whose relationship to the Empyrean was fundamentally different from that of the Imperium's servants. The fortresses had not been built for the Imperium. They had been built for something else, and the closest available analog was the forces of Chaos. Admiral Ravensburg received the reports of fortress activation with the response appropriate to a senior naval commander facing a sector-wide crisis. He requested additional warships and began a systematic campaign to recapture or deny the Chaos forces their objectives. He was good at this. The naval engagements of the Gothic War are studied in Imperial war colleges because Ravensburg's tactical flexibility was exceptional. He stretched an inadequate fleet across an enormous theater of operations and prevented Chaos from achieving strategic dominance while reinforcements were assembled. His record is impressive. He never understood what he was fighting over. The activation of the Blackstone fortresses by Chaos crews was not instantaneous. It was a process. The first teams that entered the installations found corridors that responded to their presence, but systems that remained dormant to direct interaction. The Chaos commander Soligus, a warlord whose forces had secured Fortress 4 in the outer orbit zone of the Rhinox system, spent over a year inside the installation before achieving what his reports, later recovered by Inquisitorial Intelligence Operation, describe as a first-level activation. The language in those reports reflects genuine confusion. Soligus was experienced with Chaos technology, with the demonically possessed weaponry and warp-infused void engines that comprised his fleet. The fortress operated on principles he did not recognize. He and his Mechanicus equivalent personnel, a group of corrupted magi called the Lawbrokers of Ka Akhtar, worked by exposure and elimination, activating systems and observing effects without a theoretical framework for what they were doing. They were learning a language by making sounds until something responded. After 14 months, something responded. The first functional demonstration of the Blackstone Fortress's capabilities came in the Rhinox system. The weapon test lasted 47 minutes. What happened to the planet Rhinox IV in those 47 minutes has no precise analog in Imperial experience. The fortress did not fire a beam. It did not launch munitions. It generated a spatial distortion in the immediate vicinity of the planet, a rippling compression of local space that began at the edge of the planet's atmosphere and moved inward. The planet's crust fractured. The mantle followed. The process took 47 minutes from initiation to completion. Rhinox 4 was not destroyed in the conventional sense of the word. It ceased to exist as a coherent planetary body. The mass was distributed across the system in fragments too small to be called debris and too numerous to be catalogued. The 260 million people on Rhinoc 4th were not killed in an explosion. They experienced increasingly violent seismic activity for approximately 38 minutes. Then the crust opened beneath them. Ravensburg received this report and did what a competent admiral does when a weapon of unprecedented destructive capacity appears in his theater of operations. He assigned additional warships to protecting the remaining fortresses from chaos capture and requested an immediate escalation of reinforcement priorities from Segmentum Command. Both responses were correct. Both were inadequate. He was fighting an enemy who could destroy planets. The Imperium could destroy planets too, through Exterminator's protocols, but this required proximity, specialized ordnance, and a decision chain that extended to the Inquisition. The Blackstone Fortress had destroyed a planet from orbit in 47 minutes, with a crew that had been learning the controls for barely a year. The Chaos Forces did not immediately use this capability to its maximum potential. The fortress was used in a targeted and controlled way throughout the Gothic War, not as an instrument of indiscriminate destruction. This suggests Abaddon understood the fortresses well enough to want them preserved. A weapon you detonate indiscriminately is a weapon you lose. A weapon you study and control is something else entirely. What happened in the Tarantis system changed the nature of the Gothic War irrevocably. By the 14th year of the conflict, Abaddon's forces controlled 3 of the 6 Blackstone fortresses. The Imperium controlled 2. One had been largely neutralized when Ravensburg's fleet successfully prevented Chaos Forces from completing boarding operations. Abaddon arranged the 3 fortress-class installations in a triangular formation around the Tarantis system's star. The configuration took approximately 6 weeks to establish, during which Ravensburg's forces launched 3 major interdiction attempts. All 3 failed. The fortress-class installations proved nearly impossible to destroy through conventional naval firepower. Their material construction absorbed or deflected void weapons that would have destroyed a standard Imperial battle station in minutes. When the 3 fortresses aligned and the combined weapon system activated, the star of the Tarantis system did not go nova. It did not explode. It collapsed. The star contracted in a process that took 11 days from initial activation to final extinction, its fusion reactions halting as the spatial distortion generated by the 3 linked fortresses disrupted the gravitational equilibrium maintaining them. A star that had burned for 6 billion years was extinguished in 11 days. The 4 planets of the Tarantis system did not survive. A star's sudden extinction is not a gentle process. The temperature collapse, the loss of gravitational dynamics, the gravitational waves propagating outward as the stellar mass contracted into a dark remnant. These processes were sufficient to render all 4 planetary bodies uninhabitable within weeks and destroyed as coherent structures within months. The total population of the Tarantis system at the time of the stellar extinction was approximately 47 billion. No weapon in the Imperium's inventory could do this. The most powerful exterminator's ordnance, the Life Eater virus combined with cyclonic torpedoes, could kill every living thing on a planetary surface and render the planet itself geologically unstable over decades. It could not destroy a star. The plasma weapons of Titans, the macro cannons of Emperor-class battleships, the cyclic bombardment cannons of fortress-grade installations, nothing in 10,000 years of Adeptus Mechanicus development could approach what 3 Blackstone fortresses had just done in 11 days. This was when Covenant's analysis, sitting in a classified inquisitorial archive, became urgent reading. The Magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus assigned to interpret the fortress data had a framework problem. They understood weapons in terms of energy output, of projectile mass and velocity, of radiation and chemical effects. The Blackstone fortresses did not operate within this framework. The stellar extinction at Tarantis was not the product of an energy weapon. The fortresses had not fired anything at the star. They had changed the nature of the space around it. The spatial distortion technology required to collapse a star's fusion reactions was not on the Mechanicus's map of possible technologies. It had not been theoretically modeled. It had not been imagined. They were trying to analyze an effect that their entire accumulated scientific tradition had not prepared them to understand. Covenant, working from an inquisitorial station at the sector's edge, submitted a supplemental analysis based on the stellar extinction data. His conclusion would remain classified at the highest levels for centuries afterward. The Blackstone fortresses were not built by any civilization that currently existed. They predated the Eldari Empire by an interval he could not precisely calculate, but estimated at tens of millions of years. The material they were constructed from showed a specific energy signature that appeared, in minute quantities, in Eldari Cetan phase weapons. The same signature appeared in the Necrontier's living metal, the substance called necrodermis, that comprised the immortal bodies of the Necron warriors. The implication was straightforward, if extraordinary. The Blackstone fortresses had not been built against the Eldari. They had not been built against humanity. They had been built against the Cetan. The response of the craftworld Eldari to the stellar extinction at Tarantis was swift. 3 craftworlds coordinated forces in the Gothic sector within weeks of the event: Ulthwé, Eonden, and Bieltan. The scale of their commitment indicated that the Eldari had anticipated the possibility of stellar-class weapon deployment and had prepared for it. They had not warned the Imperium that this was possible. They had prepared their own response. The Eldari's strategic objective was not to help the Imperium win the Gothic War. It was to ensure that none of the Blackstone fortresses remained in Chaos hands in a functional state. Whether this meant transferring them to Imperial custody, Eldari custody, or destroying them was a tactical question to be answered based on circumstances. The Eldari had fought the Khantan. Their cultural memory of the war in heaven, maintained in the infinity circuits of their craft worlds, and the ritual knowledge of their Bonezingers and Farseers, included specific information about weapons designed for Catan warfare. They knew what the fortresses were. They knew, with a certainty no Imperial Inquisitor could claim, exactly what Covenant had only theorized. The Eldari's operation targeted 2 of the 3 Chaos-controlled fortresses simultaneously. Using Catan phase weapons, a category of armament that the Imperium did not possess and did not fully understand, they disrupted the structural integrity of the fortress's Blackstone material. The result was controlled demolition on a scale that required precisely calibrated energy inputs across the entire structure. Both fortresses were destroyed within hours of each other. The Chaos commanders who had been operating them died in the process. The loss of 2 fortresses out of Abaddon's 3 was, by conventional military logic, a significant defeat. It was not. Abaddon lost 2 fortresses. He had spent those 2 fortresses' worth of operational time learning what he needed to know. The Eldari, in destroying the fortresses, had confirmed 2 critical data points he had suspected but not proven: that Cetan phase weapons could affect the Blackstone material, and therefore that the fortresses had been designed within the same technological tradition as the Khantan themselves. The weapon and the enemy were related. This meant the fortresses had been designed as a counter to Catan capabilities, which in turn meant their full operational potential included anti-Cetan applications he had not yet explored. He left the Gothic sector with 1 fortress and 20 years of operational data. He understood what he held. The Eldari had just told him everything he needed to know. The Eldari were aware of this. They understood the information cost of the 2 destruction operations. They proceeded anyway. The Farseer, commanding the Ulthwé forces in the sector, had made the calculation that keeping the fortresses intact in Chaos hands was a worse outcome than confirming Abaddon's theoretical framework. They were choosing between 2 bad options and selecting the less catastrophic one. This is the position the Eldari occupy throughout the history of the 41st millennium. Knowing more than any other faction, having the most complete picture of galactic-level threats, and consistently facing choices where every option involves accepting a terrible cost. The Farseer's name has not been preserved in Imperial records. The decision she made was the kind of choice that does not appear in victory narratives. She made it anyway. 20 years of naval combat left the Gothic sector diminished in ways that its official victory narrative obscured. Ravensburg's after-action reports, later declassified through inquisitorial process, document the state of the sector at the war's end with the precision of a man who had spent 2 decades making do with what he had. Battlefleet Gothic had lost 63% of its capital ships. The shipyards at Aura's Sepulchre and the Schindelgeist system had been destroyed or rendered inoperational. 11 inhabited worlds had been subjected to chaos occupation of varying duration. 5 systems had been rendered uninhabitable. The Tarantis system no longer had a star. The human cost was in the billions. It always is, in the 41st millennium. Numbers at this scale lose meaning quickly. What they represent in the Gothic War is this. Every system chaos occupied saw industrial infrastructure destroyed, agricultural capacity wrecked, gene seed repositories targeted for desecration. The damage to the sector's long-term production capacity was not repaired within a century of the war's end, and the sector still needed to be defended. The Eye of Terror had not moved. The Cadian Gate had not become less important. Battlefleet Gothic rebuilt from a significantly reduced base, drawing reinforcements from other segmentum commands that could not afford to give them. The men and women who comprised the rebuilt fleet were, in many cases, the children and grandchildren of the sailors who had fought the Gothic War. They served on ships named after vessels that had been destroyed, in positions their predecessors had held when those predecessors died. Abaddon's withdrawal from the Gothic sector in approximately 160 of the 41st millennium was conducted with the same operational precision that had characterized his campaigns. His forces did not break and flee. They disengaged in sequence, prioritizing the extraction of forces associated with the remaining chaos-controlled fortress, which was transferred into the Eye of Terror. How this was accomplished, given that the fortresses appeared to have no propulsion systems, is not recorded in Imperial documentation. The assumption among Mechanicus analysts was that a combination of conventional towing and warp drive technology was employed. The more disturbing possibility, which Covenant raised in a supplemental note, was that the fortress moved itself. Ravensburg's forces pursued the retreating Chaos Fleet with every available warship. The pursuit extended to the Cadian Gate's edge. He was correct in strategic principle. He did not recover the fortress. The formal declaration of victory over the Gothic War was issued from Segmentum Command. Medals were distributed. Ravensburg was elevated in the Admiralty. The 6 Blackstone fortresses were documented in the post-war census. 1 in Imperial custody, 2 destroyed, 3 withdrawn with Chaos forces into the Eye. The post-war strategic assessment noted that the sector had been successfully defended. It did not assess whether the strategic objectives of the Chaos campaign had been achieved. It did not ask what Abaddon had learned. It did not ask because the assumption embedded in the assessment was that Abaddon had wanted to conquer the sector and had failed. He had wanted the fortresses and the knowledge of their operation. He had 3 of them, 4 centuries of study time, and operational data from 2 full demonstrations of Stellar-class weapon capability. He had what he came for. The Blackstone Fortress in the Sentinel system became the most intensively studied Xenos artifact in the Segmentum Obscurus. It also became, in practical terms, the most expensive paperweight in the sector. The Mechanicus Magi assigned to it were among the most capable Xenos technology analysts in the Adeptus Mechanicus's inventory. They had 20 years of operational observation data, a corpus of analysis extracted through inquisitorial operation from captured Chaos documentation, and direct physical access to a functioning installation. They made measurable progress. They identified the fortress's primary power distribution network and could trace energy flows through it. They identified 19 distinct weapon systems, none of which they could activate above 10% of apparent output capacity. They produced 347 separate technical analysis reports over the following century. Not one of them could explain how the fortress had been built. The material science problem was foundational. Blackstone was not susceptible to any form of physical or energetic analysis that the Mechanicus possessed. It did not conduct electricity. It did not respond to melter heat. It did not exhibit the molecular structure that all known materials exhibit. Under the best available microscopic analysis, the Mechanicus analysts could see that the material was continuous, unbroken, structurally uniform from visible surface to the deepest point their instruments could reach. It was as though the Blackstone had not been manufactured at all, as though it had been grown or shaped at a level of material manipulation that the Mechanicus could not conceptualize. Covenant's hypothesis suggested that the Blackstone material was related to, though not identical with, the Necrontia living metal. If correct, this implied a manufacturing process that worked at the atomic level, assembling matter in patterns that conventional metallurgy could not approach. The Mechanicus rejected this interpretation on philosophical grounds. They preferred to classify it as a separate, independent technological tradition rather than concede that a Xenos species had developed material science capabilities beyond the Mechanicus's conceptual framework. This preference was understandable. It was also the reason the fortress remained inaccessible. What happened to the 3 Blackstone fortresses in Abaddon's possession between the end of the Gothic War and the 13th Black Crusade is not directly documented in any source accessible to Imperial analysts. What can be reconstructed from indirect evidence is a picture of systematic, patient study conducted over 4 centuries. Abaddon did not attempt to use all 3 fortresses as weapons immediately after the Gothic War. The Chaos forces required reintegration. The knowledge base required expansion. What the evidence suggests is a long period of controlled experimentation, of sending teams of corrupted Mechanicus personnel and warp sorcerers into the fortresses with specific analytical tasks, of systematic mapping of the fortress systems Abaddon had partially learned to activate during the Gothic War, and of theoretical modeling of the full weapon activation sequences. The Chaos sorcerers who worked within the fortresses during this period would have brought something the Mechanicus on the Sentinel system installation fundamentally lacked: a relationship with the warp that the fortress design accommodated. The fortresses responded to warp attunement. They had opened for Chaos crews where they had remained sealed to Imperial survey teams. A sorcerer capable of perceiving the Empyrean and interacting with it directly was a more appropriate interface for the fortress systems than any amount of technological instrumentation. The Mechanicus worked from the outside in. Abaddon's teams worked from the inside, in a language the fortresses recognized. The Planet Killer, Abaddon's personal flagship, serves as indirect evidence of this process. The Planet Killer's primary weapon system, known as the Armageddon Gun, was described in Battlefleet Gothic operational records as capable of destroying planetary bodies through a mechanism distinct from conventional nova cannons or cyclonic torpedoes. The precise technical principles of the Armageddon Gun are not documented in any publicly available source, but the effect bears a recognizable relationship to the weapon effects observed during the Gothic War. The Planet Killer was not built by the Blackstone Fortress's original makers. It was built by Chaos engineers who had access to 3 Blackstone fortresses and 4 centuries to study them. This is what the Gothic War purchased, not the fortresses themselves, though those were valuable. The knowledge to reverse engineer, at a crude and reduced scale, the principles by which they operated. A weapon that could destroy a planet in hours rather than a star in 11 days was nonetheless a weapon that would not have existed without the Gothic War's 20 years of operational data and 4 centuries of subsequent study. The 13th Black Crusade is the largest single military event in recent Imperial history. Its scale dwarfs every preceding Black Crusade. Its consequences, the fall of Cadia, the birth of the Great Rift, the splitting of the galaxy into the Nachmund Corridor and the isolated Imperium Nihilus, are still reverberating. Every analysis of the 13th Black Crusade begins with Cadia, with the enormous force Abaddon assembled, with the strategic irreversibility of the Cadian Gate's fall. What is less commonly analyzed is the sequence by which the Cadian pylons failed. The pylons were suppression devices. They reduced the warp's influence in the immediate area of Cadia, creating a navigable corridor that was the primary route for Imperial resupply and reinforcement to the Segmentum Obscurus. Their destruction was not the result of a direct weapon attack in the conventional sense. The sequence that led to their failure involved the positioning of Chaos forces in specific spatial relationships around Cadia, the use of the Blackstone fortress that Abaddon had retained in functional condition, and a series of spatial distortions applied to the planet's surface at precise intervals. The details are documented in the post-fall analysis conducted by surviving Mechanicus personnel and later compiled by Inquisitor General Mabon. The Blackstone fortress was not a surprise weapon at Cadia. It was the culmination of 4 centuries of study. The positioning sequences, the timing intervals, the specific system interactions required to apply spatial distortion pressure to pylon-equivalent structures, these were not improvised. They were prepared. Abaddon used the Gothic War to learn what the fortresses could do. He used the 4 centuries between wars to learn how to do it precisely, at scale, against a specific target. Cadia fell because Abaddon understood the Blackstone fortress better than the Imperium understood the pylons that were defending it. The question of what built the Blackstone fortresses has never been formally answered within Imperial scholarship. Covenant's analysis reaches the conclusion that the fortresses belong to the same technological tradition as the Old Ones, the ancient civilization whose conflict with the Necrontyr, recorded in Eldari myth as the War in Heaven, preceded the current age of the galaxy by tens of millions of years. The Old Ones were the dominant power in the galaxy before the Necrontyr's rebellion and the subsequent Canton ascendancy. When the Catan consumed the Necrontyr's souls and transformed them into the deathless Necrons, the Old Ones were their primary enemy. A weapon designed to counter the Cetan would be built to affect the nature of local space itself. The Cetan were stellar entities, beings that consumed suns and reshaped the physical laws of regions of space. A conventional weapon could not stop them. A weapon that altered the fundamental structure of local space, that could collapse gravitational equilibria or disrupt the spatial constants that Canton entities required to exist in material form, that was a weapon designed for the right enemy. The Blackstone fortresses were not built for the Imperium. They were not built for chaos. They were not built for the Eldari, though the Eldari knew enough about them to know that destroying 2 was preferable to letting Abaddon keep them. They were built by a civilization that no longer exists, against enemies that now exist only as captive shards imprisoned within Cetan phase weapons and psychically bound fragments embedded in Xenos artifacts across the galaxy. The war they were built for ended millions of years before the first human being walked upright on old Earth. The fortresses outlasted their purpose. They outlasted the civilization that built them. They outlasted the Necrontyr Empire that they were designed to counter. They were still here, still slowly rotating in the void, still maintaining their precise angular relationships to one another, when the Imperium found them and called them fortresses, because that was the closest category in the Imperial vocabulary. They are not fortresses. They are the artillery of a dead god's war. The current status of the Blackstone fortresses is not fully documented in publicly available Imperial records. One remains in Chaos possession, operational. One remains in Imperial custody in the Sentinel system, partially operational at best. 2 were destroyed by the Eldari during the Gothic War. The remaining 2 are unaccounted for. Their last confirmed positions, recorded in pre-Gothic War Mechanicus surveys, place them in systems that changed hands multiple times during the war and its aftermath. Whether they were destroyed, moved, or simply left in place when the fighting moved elsewhere is not recorded. 6 instruments capable of destroying stars, 2 confirmed destroyed, 1 held by the Imperium without the knowledge to fully use it, 1 held by Chaos whose forces have demonstrated the ability to use it, 2 missing. Covenant's final analysis, submitted to the Inquisitorial Conclave that reviewed his work 2 decades before the 13th Black Crusade, ended with a question rather than a conclusion. The fortresses had activated in response to warp-attuned beings. Chaos forces could use them because their relationship to the warp was one of immersion, of willing corruption, The Imperium could not use them because its entire institutional structure was built around rejecting the warp's influence, around the principle that contact with the Empyrean was contamination. The Necrons could not use them either. And the Necrons were the descendants of the civilization the fortresses were built to fight. The material relationship between Blackstone and Necrodermis was not that of a weapon to its target. It was the relationship of two products of the same technological tradition, something that could threaten both. Covenant asked who built them, not what they were or what they could do. Who made them and why, and whether whoever made them had considered the possibility that their weapons would still be functional when the enemies they were built for had been gone for 50 million years. He did not receive an answer. He did not expect one. The fortresses turned slowly in the void. They have been turning longer than the Imperium has existed, longer than the Eldari Empire rose and fell, longer than the Chaos Gods have inhabited the warp. Whatever war they were built for ended before the current inhabitants of the galaxy inherited it. They are still ready.